morning, afternoon to all of you who are coming to see our town hall. We have some dynamic guests that I know each and every one of you are ready and willing to hear. And I'm just excited that I was chosen to stand at their feet and listen to their expertise on what we'll be talking about racial and social justice in the city. But before we get started, I wanted to go through a few slides so that we can give some kudos to our partners and to contextualize our conversation. So this town hall is given or sponsored by the City of Toledo Human Relations Commission. In particular, what you'll see is that the Human Relations Commission is set up by the four committees: the Community and Neighborhoods, Social Justice Committee, Stop the Violence Committee, and the Youth Empowerment and Engagement Committee. This is where you could find us. We have the website at the ToledoOhio.gov, and then we also have a Facebook page, which is also sponsored by the City of Toledo. So for the Social Justice Committee, we have Christina Rodriguez and Malika Bell as our chairs, and then we also have our members, Sarah Jenkins, myself, Vera Lucia Mendoza, Betty Valentine, Kelly Webb, and Lorraine Carpenter, who is our HRC. She's on our executive committee. So here's the mission statement of, excuse me, of the Social Justice Committee. It is to build mutual respect, understanding, and acceptance in our community by promoting equality, advancing equality, and celebrating our inclusivity. Our next town hall will be next Friday, which will be given by the Youth Empowerment Committee. And it will be talking about the misconception of being Black in honor of Juneteenth. So that time will be 11:30 as well, and it will be live via the same format. So let's get started. Before we get started by asking questions, because I can tend to be a little invasive because I'm so excited, I will introduce all of our panelists and not in any particular order. So first, I will introduce RaShaya Ghee. She is a native of Toledo, a graduate of Central Catholic, fellow Irish alum. She is also a criminal defense and family law attorney in Ohio. One of the most fascinating facts that I love about her is that she received her Juris Doctor from the University of Minnesota Law School, but she is a lecturer at the University of Toledo teaching a course in race in the American law system. I haven't had a chance to take her class, but I swear if I get a chance to audit it, I want to take her class. And I'll audit it because if you look at her Facebook page, I think she's a very tough teacher. And I'm a tough teacher, so I don't want, to be back in the seat. She might make me cry with some of the edits on my paper, but she's an awesome scholar and an advocate, and as well as a dynamic attorney. Next, we'll introduce Ruth Leonard, who over the few months I have come to know and appreciate. And I'll be honest with you, I've kind of followed her over the last few years because her courage and just tenacity of being a local advocate just amazes me. But here's some tidbits about Ruth. She is from Maryland. She's from Maryland. She received her bachelor's degree from an HBCU, Bowie State University. And if you're from Maryland, you cannot say Bowie, it's Bowie State University. She's recreated social studies curriculum. She loves children, and she's an advocate for children and really focusing on culturally diverse learning opportunities. She is a dynamic community activist. She is involved in the Community Solidarity Network, but most importantly, if you've ever gone to the Black Lives Matter Awards that Toledo has locally, she is highly involved in those efforts. Next, we have Dr. Latasha Sullivan, who I will say is probably one of the most humble and smartest women that I've come to know over the last few days. I asked her for a bio and she gave me 2 sentences, so I had to Google to see how dynamic she was. Her pronouns are she, her, and hers. She's actively serving as the director of the Counseling Center at the University of Toledo, where she promotes student wellness, not only emotionally, but also looking at the physical and spiritual and social aspects of wellness and what that means. She received her bachelor's degree from psychology from the University of Toledo, and from the University of Dayton, she has a master's degree in science education. She is also a licensed professional clinical counselor with supervision in the state of Ohio. So anything regarding mental health and wellness, Dr. Sullivan is your person. Next, we have Quinlan Tyler, who, oh my gosh, I met her a year ago at the Black Lives Matters Awards, where I started researching who Ruth was. So you'll begin to see the intersections of all of our identities and our partnerships that we have with each other. But Quinlan is a community educator at Planned Parenthood, and she is an advocate for women's rights and women productive rights. She also is a phenomenal mentor of young women. Anything with community fundraising, community activism. If you have any questions about how to get elected, Quinlan is your person that you want to talk to. And I say that because she is so humble that she really doesn't brag about her activity in helping Sheena Barnes get elected for Toledo School Board. So Quinlan, she's your girl. You got to go to her if you're even thinking about politics. So shy, hint, hint. You may want to talk to Quinlan if you're thinking about running for office. So ladies, let's get started with the first question that I have for you. Today's panel is talking about how to harness our emotions and look at some action steps on building awareness and what should we be doing in terms of building a racial and socially just community in Toledo. So I start with Ruth. Thank you.
Okay. So one of the things that I have really emphasized when it comes to figuring out where you are most valued in this movement to create equality, justice, and accountability is to figure out what your gifts and talents are. If you're a writer, then write. If you're a singer, then sing. If you are really good at numbers, then you can help work the books for an organization. But once you figure out what your gift or talent is, then you simply go out and you ask the people who are directly affected, what do they need help with? A lot of times when you get into the spirit of activism, you tend to try to make decisions for people. You try to figure out what worked for you, and so you want to implement that in their lives when the resources that were available to you may not be available to them. So once you've figured out what your gifts and talents are, then you go out and you ask people how you can help them. Another thing that I strongly encourage is, especially coming from allies, if you will, look at what your neighborhood looks like, and then think about those neighborhoods that you don't normally go to. Why don't you normally go to those neighborhoods? What resources can you see that they're lacking? And then how do you use your privilege or your position in order to encourage stakeholders in that community to uplift their voices so that they can ask for what it is that they need? I think that's like the ground game for anyone who's new to activism, and for people who are currently involved, just continuing to invite people into the conversations. There's been certain situations where people want to hold control, and when you hold on to control, especially in activism, then it becomes your vision that's being executed and not those who are, in many cases, directly affected.
Ooh, thank you. I've taken some notes, but I'm gonna segue to RaShaya to see if she can kind of build this thing up. Yeah.
So yes, thank you. So I didn't realize, Madam Moderator, that we were being called on. I would have, like prepared or something a little better. I thought it was like a voluntary thing, but don't worry about it. I'll dive right in. So one of the things I think, and what I'll do is I'll pivot from what Ruth said, because Ruth talked about what allies can do. I think it's also really important to affirm people of color and their contributions. And one of the things that I think is really simple, but it's been uncommon for so long that we don't do it, is just existing in your authenticity in your spaces, the spaces that you access, being your authentic self. We talk a lot in the scholarship and even in the movement about code switching, right? About the pressure to fit within these models that have been touted as the standard for professionalism, as the standard for acceptability, right? What we call in the racial justice parlance, kind of neutralizing racial markers, right? We talk about the ways in which we're required to perform, right? Our identity, right? The way in which respectability politics is how we describe it, right? This idea that I am supposed to dress a certain way, I am supposed to talk a certain way, I am supposed to wear my hair a certain way, so that I can make it in this space, so that I can navigate this space, so I can make all of those people around me comfortable by neutralizing any racial or ethnic markers. And I think existing in your authenticity, being who you are, one of the things I try to do as an attorney is to be very conscious of the ways in which race were involved in that moment, in that case, in that courtroom, and to bring people's attention to it, because I have the unique ability to do that as a person of color in that position. And so I think the more free you are, the more space you make it for someone behind you to be more free, right? And freedom means existing as your authentic self, right? And so one of the things I'm encouraging, especially Black professionals to do, is to exist authentically in these spaces that we've been traditionally unable to access, so that they can make more room and more space for the person behind them to exist more freely. And I think the more we normalize existing authentically in our authentic selves, the more we normalize the full spectrum of our humanity, not just those parts which have been traditionally held up as the standard, right? That all Black people have to look like this, act like this, talk like this, dress like this in order to be accepted in this space. The more we exist in our authentic selves, that is a form of resistance first. And then secondly, the easier we will make it for people who've traditionally not had access to these spaces to be free in those spaces. So I think that that's huge, especially at a time like now. And on my Facebook, if your employer isn't making space for you to talk about and process the events of the last couple of weeks, that's a problem. If they're expecting you to exist the way you were before George Floyd happened, they're not engaging you about what the office can be doing to support you in this time, that's a problem. And it's okay to draw attention to that. It's okay to make them aware of that. And in fact, I think it's necessary. And so those are some of the things I'm encouraging professionals of color to do.
Okay, thank you. Oh, wow. Is it okay, Dr. Sullivan, if we segue to you? Because RaShaya mentioned some really good points about authenticity and being free to be yourself. And how do you see this playing out in some of the work that you do, focusing on wellness and mental health and dealing with, these issues of, racial compromise and things of that nature?
Absolutely. I think it's a big part about our mental health, because when we think about historically, addressing mental health was not set up for us, or when the conversation came about mental health, it was always from a deficit and from a negative, not thinking about our well-being and our mental health. And so it's really important that I think giving attention to our mental health is important, because our mental health is worthy of being protected, supported, and validated, just like our lives are. And so when we're doing this work, it's really important that we're able to assess what we need in the moment, how we're responding and experiencing the things that we're having, and being able to identify what spaces we have to actually do that raw. We often have to sugarcoat and pretend and put on masks in front of other people. So just like Shaya mentioned, that if you're at work and they're not creating spaces, but yet we're expected to show up anyway and perform to a certain degree and level. But yet, what is that doing on the inside to us? What are we denying about ourselves when we're not able to say that this has affected me, this has affected my family, this has affected my community, and I'm trying to navigate two worlds at one time. And so it's really important, I think, for sometimes for us to have spaces where we can slow down, to be able to even just do a self-check to say, how am I experiencing this? How has this affected me? What do I need in this moment? And creating spaces and identifying where are my safe spaces to do that. Because I think that's the other place, is that sometimes we are going to be in positions where we can't express whatever that raw emotion is right now, because that may not be safe for us to do. It may not be appropriate, you know, for us to be able to continue to progress in our career, not to be perceived negatively. And so we have to find where are our safe spaces and communities, to whether it's at home, whether it's going to our car, whether it's going into the bathroom, into the stall, you know, sending a text message to somebody to say that they're getting on my nerve right now. I feel like I'm gonna blow up. I need somebody to talk to right now, or to say these things in text that I can't say out loud to this individual. And how can I reframe that in a way to be able to get through my day? And so even with that, that also means we have to know what our boundaries are and what our distress tolerance are. So where are our limits? You know, if you're in a space to say, this is too much for me to handle today, then what are your options? Can you take a half day? Can you take an early lunch? You know, is it that you're able to then maybe have a colleague that you're able to kind of pull sidebar and process some of the things that you're experiencing with? And so our mental health is not to be put on the back burner. It's something that we have to learn how to navigate. And so it's okay to have spaces where it comes out just the way that you experience it. And then there's sometimes that we have to navigate it to say, okay, I'm going to have a reaction to this, but in front of you, this is how I'm going to respond. And so we have to also, though, I think the challenge that we've had a lot oftentimes is that we haven't come back to the emotion or whatever the response was. So because we've had to pretend or put on a face, we just keep going and just kind of grit our teeth and say, well, it doesn't matter anyway, nobody cares, or I have to keep going. You do have to keep going, but it doesn't mean you have to ignore however you felt. And that may mean later on, a couple hours later, you say, you know, I need to revisit what was happening then. And I need to let myself express the emotion that I couldn't express at that period of time. And I need to attend to what that is for myself. And so as we're having this conversation, even as I was preparing to think about what my role was on the panel, I was very reminded of the fact that there's oftentimes the stigma of expressing emotion, but we have them, whether we're supposed to, people expect us to express them or not. And because we are humans, and because our lives matter too, our emotions matter, and our responses to situations matter. And what we need in those moments, we have to find ways that we can express them safely and in ways that feel productive to us. So whether that means that we collaborate with other individuals to have, to be engaged in the community, to use our talents, as Ruth said, I love that you said, what are your skills, right? That's a way to utilize even and channel your emotions into something. And so as we have this conversation, for those that are listening, I challenge you, if you don't know what an emotion or a feeling is, look at a feeling chart to get some language around it, and then say, okay, how can I express these emotions that maybe I have not acknowledged before?
Yeah. Thank you. Oh,
Can I jump in with one thing really quickly?
Yes.
Okay, so I think that it's fantastic that we are talking about this in professional fields, but I don't want us to forget about students who are still learning this kind of language and this navigation through that. So I know that I believe it was last year, TPS, Toledo Public Schools, did a survey of sorts, and the number one mental health issue that students were carrying with them into schools was depression. And if you take the depression that a student is feeling and you add that into navigating your racial identity, then it's a lot that these students have to unpack. And so there's research that comes out of, I want to say it was in Texas, that talked about the impact of racial stereotypes on Black girls as learners. And we already have like this, there's a clear understanding of us as Black women, what it's like to deal with all of those stereotypes as a student. But in this, it talked about, in the research, it talked about the importance of not being racially neutral, because I think a lot of times that's where students learn to code switch, is when you don't want to engage because you don't know how to engage. And so now you're learning to navigate academically in a world where you don't express yourself, in a world where you have to tame yourself, in a world where if you're loud, you become that loud Black girl in the classroom as opposed to that leader who is speaking her mind. So I just want to make sure that we don't forget the students in this whole conversation.
Thank you for that clarity, because I think if all of us, and while you were speaking, I was thinking about my own research on Black girls, but then thinking about what it was like being a smart Black girl in predominantly white spaces in which I was educated, and learning how, to code switch and what that did, when you have to deal with imposter syndrome and all of those other things that arise. Quinlan, is it okay if I switch to you to just kind of ask you from a community health expert point of view, how do you see all of these, with the code switching, the mental health, being an ally in your community work? Do you see any intersections of any of these playing out?
Definitely, when we talk about health of our community, there always is, of course, it's informed by racism and all of these other things. But I think back to, everybody else was saying, like, there are just so many other barriers that we have to overcome before we even step into a doctor's office, right? And then the stigma around, mental health and Black mental health at that. I think that we can't just break all of these things apart. But it's back to what Ruth was saying too. It's kind of, because I mostly work with young people, it's interesting to see at this point in this intersection where, we're really being more open and vocal about how race and racism is affecting us, and our young people are being more open and more vocal about how racism is affecting them in their mental health. It's interesting to see and even have these conversations with my young folks about like where they see themselves and who they trust. And this kind of just general distrust of not only our police systems, but the larger systems, right? The systems that they're currently being educated in, our healthcare system, right? And it's that our young people have always noticed these things. And I am always just in awe of how our young people are watching and absorbing everything that we're saying, as far as like, not neutralizing racial markers, right? Where one of my students says, even said to me, and it just kind of blew me back, that even like they don't believe in code switching. And it was something that they were like, I don't understand why, why I have to swallow parts of myself to make other people accept that. And it just really made me kind of do some internal thinking, because I'm similar to what everyone else had said, echoing that. It's just, I was taught in predominantly white institutions as well. I myself have learned, we learn those things, and those are things that we have to unpack. But I also think that as we have these conversations and move forward into talking about what we can do now, I think it's accepting and really lifting forward the voices of the young people as well, because not only are they talking about these things as well, but they're looking at them in a way that is even beyond myself. And I mean, I still consider myself a young person, but there's such a gap as far as like the way that they're decolonizing, the way that they're learning on their own, and the reflectiveness of this generation that is just astounding to me.
I've been saying for a while now that young people, and I've seen Ruth and RaShaya, I've seen all of you mention the same thing, that young people are going to save us all. Because they're not ascribing to some of the things that we were taught were okay. And as RaShaya mentioned, if we give them that opportunity to exist in their authenticity and be free, then we know that we're doing something good and giving them that space to do that. We have a question. Oh,
Can
sorry.
I back just really quickly?
Yes.
First off, Quinlan, I don't know why you're special. You're the only person she asked if it were okay if she were going to switch to. The rest of it, she just let us know it's your turn. Quinlan, she wanted to make sure Quinlan was okay with it though. But Quinlan, after this, you're going to have to teach me your secrets, right? So I also can be asked if it's okay. But what I will just add to this is this idea, which I think we all know because we're here, right? And this space exists for us. So I'm sure that a lot of us who are accessing this talk right now know this, but I want to just reinforce it and say it explicitly that racial neutrality is dangerous. It is so, so, so dangerous because you cannot be racially neutral in a society that's racist, right? In a society that has racism baked into its foundation, into its founding documents, into its economic structure. There is no such thing as racial neutrality. What there is feigned racial ignorance, where you can pretend that you do not acknowledge and you will refuse to engage the things that have serious, significant impacts on people's lives, right? Race arranges so much of our society and informs every societal institution. It's pervasive. There's no space racism has not touched. And so to not acknowledge its existence is one of the linchpins of how it's able to reinvent itself and how it's able to exist in perpetuity, because we have embraced this idea that we will ignore it. We've conflated racial neutrality with racial equality. In our minds, they are the same. In our laws, they are the same. And they are that position is so detrimental. It's why I encourage people to be color conscious instead of color blind, because it is so detrimental, right? This idea of racial neutrality. So we've all said it. I just want to make sure I'm saying it explicitly, especially to listeners who may not have heard that, this for the first time, that racial neutrality is a problem, but it is so dangerous.
Yes. I love you all. I really do. And I always say when RaShaya and I work together, she's one of the few women that she checks me so well. And I love it. And I take it in grace because I'm like, you know what? She got me. She got me. But we do have a question coming in for RaShaya and Ruth to talk about the ordinance that you worked on that was introduced into City Council this week.
See, I just tried to Patrice Ruth. It didn't work as well. I just tried to tell Ruth it was her turn and she just pointed at me and then I started talking. So again, I'm gonna, use this opportunity after this to learn. I'm actually going to let Ruth talk about this. We introduced an ordinance that aims to reform and democratize the power inequities between our law enforcement officers and our communities. Power inequities are the genesis of all inequalities, right? There's an imbalance in power somewhere, right? And so one of the things that we like to think about is, what ways we can empower those people who historically not had any to help ameliorate situations of inequity. And so this legislation is an endeavor towards that end. The legislation requires police officers to give citizens they interact with a card with the officer's name, the officer's badge number, and contact information for the Civilian Review Board, with the hopes that it will increase not only accountability for the officer, but also perceptions of trust and community relationships between police and local law enforcement. Ruth?
So yes, everything RaShaya stated is 100% on point, as always. But I think this comes out of the major uprising and the realization that the way that police have been functioning since the beginning of time has been unfair and has openly targeted Black and Brown communities. And we've seen it time and time again in public. We've seen it. There are, I'm sure, thousands of stories that people have of private moments where police have been unfairly executing their power, not only because of, number one, their ability to, but also the lack of accountability on that part of the police department. And so this is the first step in what I would say would be a series of reforms that RaShaya, myself, and a handful of others are working on to, number one, create accountability. Because a lot of times when you have an interaction with the police, especially as a Black person, you're already shaking, you're already unnerved, you're already worried about whether or not you'll be safe. And so, like I said, this is just the first step in which officers do not have the opportunity to face some sort of an uprising of anger. Because I know a lot of times that I've seen police officers interacting with people, the simple act of asking an officer for their name and badge number is seen as a threat. And it can also be the first step of inciting violence on the part of the officer. So now we're going to take away one of the opportunities where violence can escalate. So this was a research idea that has come out of a couple of other cities where we want to make sure that police officers are accountable. Because for instance, when a couple of years ago, police officers walked into my home without knocking, they just were standing in my living room. And I was too shaken up at the fact that there were officers who I had not invited into my home to even ask for their badge numbers or for their names, or to look out of the window of the police car. I know now that with this first step, at the very least, there will be a business card that I can say Officer so-and-so and such walked into my home. The work that we are doing, though, through City Council, once again, is just the first step in a series of many. And it's kind of the last straw. I won't say kind of, it's the last straw that we have before there is full actual demands for a defunding of the police, and with the pie in the sky hopes of the abolishment of the police. Because again, police were founded to be slave catchers, and all they've done now is add to their list of responsibilities. So not only are they modern day slave catchers, but now they're also on-call psychologists, on-call social workers, on-call therapists. So we're looking to take the responsibilities away from the police department. And we're also looking to, in this first step, create more accountability. It's much less likely that an officer will engage in conduct unbefitting of a civil servant if they know that you have their name and their badge number. And also, I just want to throw in the protests that have taken place around the country are slowly, and I say this very intentionally, they're slowly changing how policing is happening. And so it's coming from the inside out. So it's in things like with Toledo City Council, or the mayor of Toledo making the decision to remove the complaint office for the police out of the police precinct. It's already fearful enough to engage with the police, but then to have to go and make a statement against the police in their own house. That's why we have such a low number, I believe, of officers being called out, officers being held accountable. So once again, the cards that we're asking for officers to have on their persons to hand out to people is just the first step. Also, really quickly, we're in this for the long haul, because even with something as simple as a business card, with something that thousands of people already carry on them, there's already pushback coming from certain members of City Council. And in that pushback, we see that the level of accountability is, they're so afraid of it that they're trying to keep this from moving forward. They're trying to keep this from going and passing in legislation. So now I take this as an educator and an activist. If you're not willing to be accountable for the things that you do, why do you still have a job? If I can't be accountable to my students, I shouldn't be teaching. If I don't take my responsibilities as an activist and what that means and all that encompasses, and I'm willing to put my name on the line, then I shouldn't be out here doing this. There was one video where someone talked about, what is your why? Why are you a police officer? If it's to cause harm, if it's to meet a quota, if it's to protect citizens by arresting them, then this is not the job for you.
You bring up some very good points, and we have a question coming in about this, another question coming in about this ordinance, where you mentioned there's some pushback. Our constituents would like to know if it's possible, or if you know, or if any of you know, who's giving the pushback, and then what is their responsibility, or what actions can they take as a citizen to ensure this level of accountability that you're discussing with the card for the police? What can the citizens do to push this forward?
So the council member who is being most vocal about holding up this vote is Council Member Gary Johnson. He's had a long run of, supporting the police. He ran for sheriff. Unfortunately, he didn't make it out of the primary. And so now he seems to have dug his heels in on making sure that that the police union is protected. And so what people can do is they can go to defund12.org. And this is a website in which a letter is already created. All you do is fill in your information, you can add to it. And when you hit send, it goes out to all of the members of city council and local government. And what that does is that takes us to the next step, where I talked about we first are attempting to reform, eventually it will become defund, and then finally abolish. So if the goal is to get as many letters as possible to city council to let them know how serious it is that we start holding officers accountable. And what that letter will do is it will show that there is community support to defund the police. And in the support of defunding the police, it is the goal that there will be some sort of pressure to, at the start, have these business cards out. Because once again, it's going to be a long trek to freedom. It's going to take a long time to get what we want, but we start somewhere. And that starts with, number one, encouraging city council to push through this legislation, and then also letting them know that you are in support of whatever legislation comes out that supports the accountability, justice, and equality of police as citizens, first and foremost.
Thank you. Sorry, RaShaya, did you have something to add?
Just briefly, I have just 3 points, because I think all of us kind of, I was going to say traffic, but that's probably the wrong word. All of us are so used to a lot of the stuff we're talking about that we sometimes will skip over some of the foundational stuff that maybe a lot of our viewers are less familiar with. So I want to just expound upon 3 things that Ruth said that I think is really, really important. The first is, I know people have this knee-jerk reaction when we talk about police officers as slave patrol catchers. Oftentimes, I think that that's because the idea of slavery, right, as being bad and being wrong seems antithetical to the ideas of police officers being good, being vested or cloaked in a presumption of rectitude, right? And so the reality, though, is that if you look at the history of law enforcement and the Black community, there has never been a time in history where law enforcement has aligned with the freedom struggle of the Black community, right? So if you talk about slavery, right, there were laws that had to be enforced about slaves running away, about slaves being able to leave the plantation. You needed an agency to enforce those laws. And so we created slave patrols. That is the genesis of law enforcement. And this is documented on law enforcement sites. I think that there's a lawenforcementmuseum.org has a whole lesson about slave patrols, and that being the origins of police officers. After slavery, there's convict leasing, where these laws that are very flimsy are erected, right? Vagrancy laws are erected and used disproportionately against African-American men. Law enforcement enforce those laws. After convict leasing, you have Jim Crow, where there's legalized segregation, where Black folks are legally not allowed to do a ton of things. The people enforcing those segregation laws are law enforcement. In addition to that, there's tons of extra legal violence being perpetrated, terrorism being perpetrated against Black people in the form of lynching campaigns that law enforcement often allowed to happen. Jail doors were opened so that people who were accused of crime could be taken out and lynched. Law enforcement often participated in the lynchings. They were community events. Folks went, took pictures, sent out postcards from these events, and law enforcement was often there. After Jim Crow, you have the civil rights movement. It was often law enforcement who are breaking up peaceful demonstrations, who are using hoses and dogs, who are covering up the murders of civil rights activists There is a podcast on NPR called White Lies that chronicles this in incredible detail. After civil rights, you have the Black Panthers and the Black Power movement. And the Black Panthers said, hey, we've suffered too much racial terror that the police have not protected us from. And so we're going to start arming and protecting ourselves. And then they were hyper-policed. And then you have war on drugs and mass incarceration, which officers have been at the front lines at. There's been a continuum, and the trajectory of law enforcement in our history is that they have not been aligned with the freedom struggle of African Americans. So there is a whole historical tension there that bubbles to the surface when these incidents happen, that we don't talk about openly in educational spaces, and that many people, if you are not a person of color, don't understand, or particularly a Black person, don't understand the history of. And I think it's really important too. I know a lot of people are like, well, how do all the Black people know about this? All right, so these were things were really, really prevalent in the South, right? 95% of African Americans lived in the South before the Great Migration. 95% with the Great Migrations from 1910 to 1940, 95%. So many of these, and then we're an oral history kind of community. Many of these things are transmitted through oral histories down to, so you teach your children about the police and how to act and behave. I know you've all heard of the talk, right? That we have to give our children. So these stories are transmitted and they're part of our societal DNA. They're part of how we understand ourselves in this community in relationship to the cops. And so I think that's really, really important to think about. The second thing we talked about, or I think Patrice asked, was what can we do as community members? We need to start vetting our politicians. We need to start vetting our politicians. I see politician after politician after politician. They come to Black churches when they want the Black vote. They stand up there and they make promises about what they believe and how they're going to help. Gary Johnson is a prime example. He came to my church and said about how he was going to make laws to help Black and brown people, particularly laws as they relate to the police department. And yet he has been an opponent of this since it was introduced. He came to Jerusalem Church when I moderated a panel with the chief of police and Judge Cubbin. He stood up and said the same thing about how he wanted to improve community relations between Black people and law enforcement. And here we are at one of the most critical moments I've ever experienced in my life in terms of an opportunity to do that. He has not introduced any legislation to effectuate that. He's only opposed the only legislation that has been introduced for a vote at this point. And so I think it's really, really important that instead of giving our politicians a stage and a platform on which to peddle whatever propaganda they need to get themselves elected, that we start vetting our politicians and demanding some accountability. They're not doing us a favor by coming to our church. They need our votes, right? They have a responsibility to them, because how many of those politicians do you see in your church after they're elected, right? How many of them give you an opportunity to ask them questions about what it is that they're going to do to improve the conditions of the most marginalized in the society? We need to have them submit platforms. We need to ask for records. If you're a judge, what is your sentencing to confinement record, and what is your racial composition of that, right? If you're if you want to be a city council person, you want to vote, how many pieces of legislation have you introduced that are particularly directed toward? We need to be asking these questions. No one is coming to save us. We are the people we've been waiting for, and it is incumbent upon us to do these things. Okay, I'm done.
Amen. And where do we pass the offering plate? Okay. And this is why I feel that this conversation that we're having today is so important, because even as I'm sitting here taking notes, I am learning myself, and it's giving me that, you know, everyone says you just say what's on your mind, but I'm getting a different level of information that I need to be able to push forward. So I appreciate each and every one of you. I'm gonna go to the chat real quick. Shaylee Matani is asking about the Civilian Police Review Board. If you wanna know more information about that Civilian Police Review Board, you can contact tcprb@toledoohio.gov. Or if you want to know more information from an activist standpoint, Shaylee, I encourage you to reach out to our panelists. Also, we have Ramona Flint Overa, who asked about what accountability is there for the police with this new legislation. And I believe Ruth and RaShaya kind of elaborated on that. But Ramona, if you want some more information, RaShaya and Ruth worked on that legislation, and they would be happy to share with you. I'm going to segue a little bit, we're talking about, you know, and I love vetting politicians, right? I love vetting them when they come to our churches, asking them, what can you do for us and what have you done? And so I want to talk about that in the context of allyship. As of late in the past few weeks, we've been seeing an asking of what can we do as white people. Comment or give me your ideas on how can, and there's a question that came earlier, how can, and the person wants to remain anonymous, so I'll ask the question for her. How can she be an advocate and an ally as a white woman for racial and social justice? I'll open it up to whoever wants to go first. How about we'll start? That's one of the.
I'll jump in here because
yes.
I'll jump in.
Okay, go for it. So how can she become an ally?
So I think, you know, that's, yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. And I think for me, standing in solidarity, you know, with Black folks is, there's a lot of things that you can do, right? I think that one of the things too is just always constantly, and I even as a Black woman, I'm constantly learning and, you know, growing. So never be afraid to ask questions or to learn or grow or reach out to other folks. I think it starts there, but I think it also starts in, as kind of RaShaya was alluding to in her comments, learning about our history as far as what we've done, where we come from, and really understanding how systematic and deeply rooted this racism is. Because I really believe that, like, in understanding that makes you can kind of start to meet us where we are at. But then it's also about centering Black voices, right, in this movement. And a lot of times when people enter these spaces where people have been doing this work, where our communities have been doing this work for years, right, it's about entering and understanding that there are already folks here who are doing this work, and that it is about who is already in these spaces and respecting that, but really centering those voices and supporting them in whatever way you can, right? And as Ruth said earlier about, you know, what skills can you offer to this movement? What skills can you bring to the table? But really also working to help educate your community as well. I can speak for me personally, like, there's a level of fatigue that happens and always having to reach out and educate other folks. Or, you know, when something happens within the movement, you know, all of a sudden, like, my text messages and my messages blow up. And while I'm also internally trying to ground myself and deal with my own mental health while living in this era, it is so hard and exhausting to always have to, or the earnest be put upon to educate, right? And I think those conversations can happen in friend groups. You know, if you're with your other white friends, you know, do that education, because I think too, a lot of the time the earnest is put on us as Black folks. And I think that is just, for me, you know, a base starting point.
Thank you. Dr. Sullivan?
Yeah, I want to jump in before RaShaya and Ruth get to it, and I won't have anything to say after that. But I think Quinlan is a good stage to think this out for me. I think I appreciate the fact that this person is asking this question in this panel, and I encourage this person to do research on their own and not rely on people that are within the community to inform them. I think that's the place, is that oftentimes when you ask, you're taking the focus off of the movement or the person that's experiencing it onto a, you know, what was me? I feel so, you know, overwhelmed by what was happening, not acknowledging that we've been feeling that way. We've been experiencing this. And so now it's at your doorstep and you're feeling powerless too. We've been carrying that torch for a long time. And so taking some responsibility to say, well, because I don't know, I do want to be informed, but it's okay to ask, like, are there any particular literature that you think might be most helpful to me? So I can say yes, maybe reading, a particular book or going to some particular, authors or research to help guide that, but not for me to give you that education. The second part is once you have a little bit of information, apply it to your own life first. Evaluate what's in your home. How are you practicing? Because I think one of the things that comes up is that we try to send messages to our kids, but then our lifestyle doesn't match what we're telling them. They're going to be watching what we're doing. And so if you're reading about allyship and you're reading about the Black Lives Movement and about our history, and then your spouse is still saying things in front of your children, or when you go to the grocery store, you have an interaction with someone and you have not evaluated your own behavior, you're not an ally. And so in that, it's really important that you evaluate what practices you're doing, how you're embodying it in your day-to-day living, not just having intellectual knowledge, but the practice of it. And another thing that I read recently that I thought was really helpful and profound is don't call yourself an ally. Let the people that are representing the movement identify that for you. So you have to, so just like how Shaya said, we have to start vetting, our politicians have to start vetting these allies, because you can't speak for a community to which you're not giving the opportunity for them to have a voice. And I think Ruth mentioned this earlier, that when you come in to be a part of a movement, don't speak for us, speak with us, ask us what we need to be spoken for. And so, but the first part is you have to be educated on what we're even talking about. You have to do some assessment of what does this look like in my own life, and be comfortable with the uncomfortable, because it's going to be uncomfortable. You're going to find out things that even if you didn't think that you were racist, that you benefited from a racist system for all your life. So being okay to acknowledge, even though I wasn't consciously contributing, I was unconsciously benefiting. And let that be present. We're not asking you to say sorry. We're asking you to acknowledge it and then say, okay, what can I do now? So again, inform yourself, read books, read books that are written people that actually are part of the movement, that actually are knowledgeable. Be very prudent about the information that you're taking in, and then look at what's in your own home, and then spark people that are your peers. This other thing I think right now, because we're watching social media and we're in a cancel culture, which I can't say I haven't blocked people myself, but you have the opportunity to change more hearts of people you know than people you don't. And so if your grandma, your grandpa, your aunt, your uncle have not engaged in these conversations, those might be the first people to actually have these conversations with, start helping us in that change. And so, it may not be to be so quick, as potential allies to uninvite people, but to maybe bring them to your dinner table and say, I'm really very thoughtful about some literature that I read. I'd like to share it with you. I'd like to share these experiences, this information, because we can change hearts with that versus kind of yelling from the other side of the room. And oftentimes those conversations are more palatable with someone that looks like them than coming from someone that doesn't. So I'm gonna pass the torch to these other ladies.
I want to say too, I learned about something new from some white allies, people I would call allies, that there's like wokeness contest among white people. This is not a thing, white allies, okay? This is not a thing, like wokeness contest. Like wokeness as a currency is another way of centering yourself. So I think it's really, really important that when you do this work, it's not a badge of honor, because I saw a meme on social media I thought was really helpful, or an analogy rather on social media I thought was really helpful. And they were like, imagine coming to class an hour late, right? And you don't expect anyone to stop. You don't expect everyone to fill you in on everything that's happened. You acknowledge that you're an hour late. You try to sneak into class and catch up and then contribute. You're like 400 years late, right? Like this is legit, like super late, right? So we need you to like sneak in, figure out how you can catch up, and then like do the work. Like it's not a badge of honor that you got to class, right? It's not a badge of honor that you're trying to catch up, because we all acknowledge that like you're a little late, right? So I think it's important to use that frame of perspective when you engage, because like when I hear like white people are like, I'm gonna outwoke you, and one of the reasons when they said it to me here, I was kind of like, one of my favorite authors, a book about slavery called The Half Has Not Been Told, Edward Baptist. He's a Cornell professor. I follow him on Twitter, and his like Twitter bio is like, I'm not meeting you out and behind the school for a woke contest or to out woke you or something. And I was like, this is really a thing. We've got to like not be a thing with that. So I really encourage, the more you can keep your allieness, and the more you can downplay it and not make it a thing, right? And just do it, just be the ally, the work. Just, I think that that's a better thing than we don't want to use alliedness as a currency. That's another way to center whiteness. And we're trying to decenter whiteness so that we can have a more equitable society.
Right. Ruth?
So everything that everyone has said so far, I 100% agree with. The way that I have encouraged people, white women specifically, because that's been like the audience that I've had for a speech that I just did, I encourage them that the goal is to, yes, you start off as an ally. You show up and you're recognizing that this fight is happening. You're recognizing that this change has to happen. But the goal that I give is for you as someone with white privilege is to become an accomplice. Because I see the fight that we're in, we are fighting a structure in which the ability to say and acknowledge that Black Lives Matter is seen as a threat, it's seen as illegal, it's seen as like you're not following the rules. So if I'm going to be a rule breaker and fight for Black Lives to Matter as a Black woman, then I need you to be an accomplice in this fight. I need you, I think Dr. Sullivan stated, you take this conversation to your family. You are now responsible. If you are going to consider yourself as someone who supports this movement, you now have to take this conversation and have those uncomfortable conversations with your friends, with your family. You have to put something on the line, because my standing up and stating that Black Lives Matter, I am now seen as, and we all are in some aspects, seen as the quote unquote loud Black woman who can't just follow the rules and go along with the go along. I need white women and white men to have that conversation. I don't need to have the conversation with you because you got audiobooks, you got YouTube, you got Google, there are so many rich resources you have access to in the 21st century that even if you go to a Black person and say, where can I start? Like RaShaya was stating, you have the slave patrols, convict leasing, Jim Crow, lynching campaigns, Black Panthers, war on drugs, mass incarceration. Pick one of those and research that. And then you start to begin to be empathic to the fight that we're in. And you take that fight to your people. And you say, even if it's something as simple as sitting down at the table and having that uncomfortable conversation, do you guys know about Jim Crow laws? It's wild that was a thing. And I understand why X, Y, and Z is happening. And while I can't speak for other people, I understand their fight. Do you get it? Do you want to learn more? And through that conversation, you are now building that foundation that Dr. Sullivan spoke about, where you want your children to, in essence, be better than you, but you're not practicing it. You have to practice it in the home, and you have to have those conversations with your family in order to even be able to say that you consider yourself an ally. Because if you can't do it behind closed doors, if you can't do it when there's no one Black in the room, if you can't do it when people are making racist jokes, then don't do it when you're surrounded by Black people. Like, what is it? Integrity is what happens when nobody is watching. It's the same thing in this fight for the Black Lives Matter movement. If you're going to be an ally when we're not there. Stand up for us. Make sure our voices are brought into the room.
Whew. This is awesome.
They're going to kick us out. They are going to kick us out. I don't know if we're going to get to do this again, but we should make sure it's meaningful, because we
just going to have a private Zoom and just put it out on Facebook.
And it's going to be my fault, but that's okay. I have broad shoulders. So coming from the chat, Dr. Leslie Leland Brown also speaks to how do we speak to the privilege that comes from the expectation that in the midst of our exhaustion, we have to be resources to allies? And I believe Dr. Sullivan and Ruth, you all mentioned to that, take something, learn it, go back, researches, and talk to your families, because we can't fight and it's a lot going on. So thank you, Dr. Brown.
People aren't experts. Like, all Black people are not experts on race. Like, there are Black people who are experts on everything you can think of. So, like, don't assume that just because someone is Black, they have all this racial insight. That person might be a physicist, and what they want to talk to you, physicist. Physicist was right, and I think that's what I said first. So scratch everything after that. And that's what they want to talk to you about. Or they're, the Black people are experts in everything. Not every Black person is a racial justice expert or a racism expert. So if you're gonna ask those questions, you should ask them to people like me or Dr. P or Dr. Sullivan, people who this is their area, right? And so they don't mind having those dialogues with you. But if you go into the grocery clerk, like, hey, on your break, I just want to talk to you really quickly and ask you about white supremacy. Can you explain this to me? I see that you're Black, so I assume that you have all this, knowledge that you're wedding. Like, that's just not a thing, right? What all Black people have is racial insight, having lived in this body, in a racialized body, in a racist society. They can tell you about their experiences, but that does not necessarily mean they can tell you about the entire history of American racism or every, the infrastructure that we use in Scotland. Like, don't assume that, because that in and of itself, right? Assuming that every Black person can teach you about racism is a form of racism, right? It puts this burden on Black people that everyone else doesn't have, because I don't assume every white person can tell me about the history of white people and when they became white and what white supremacy is. Like, I don't assume that, right? So I think that that's really important to keep in mind too.
Thank you.
I also want to ask, being mindful of when you ask for someone to speak about this, because I think there's been a lot of times where, be in a room full of, a professional room, you could be in a classroom, you could be in a lot of different places, and you may be the only one or one of two, and they want you to speak to educate the group, and it may not be the appropriate time to do so, because you're not already in that situation, not acknowledging your privilege by even asking and putting that person on the spot to then say, speak for this whole culture, for this whole race, and inform us, please, give us all your knowledge right now. And so I think it's being very mindful of when you're asking, and then what you're willing to do with the information you learn. Because there's too often times where we have these dialogues and then you walk away unchanged. You say, oh, I didn't know that. And then you do nothing different. I remember being in a situation where I was often asked to be the person to speak up, or I'm not speaking in the room, and they said, well, Tasha, what do you think? That's also an exercise of privilege, right? If I wanted to say something, I would have. I assure you of that. And so I think that's also another mindful of it when we're in spaces, is how we're calling people out and what is the intention behind you doing that, and are you calling the right person out? So I think Shia brought up a really great point, that not everybody represents the information that you may be seeking, and so keeping that in mind as well. But then I think also for those that are being asked, to be able to then say, maybe at a different time, or I think there's some other people that I can direct you to that I think will give you a much richer conversation to give you that information, that we have to be able and to say that. I think even for children, to be able to say, that's a great question. Let's go over to this person and maybe we can come up with some resources for you. Because it's not one individual's responsibility to educate the whole.
Yes.
Also, you need to pay Black people. That you need to pay for that knowledge. That is not free. We put all kinds of labor, intellectual labor, into finding these things out. These things aren't taught to us in school. Our parents aren't like walking, talking encyclopedias of Blackness. Like, we legit have to go, and because it's not taught in school, I think that's why the information is that even that much more valuable, right? Because it's not taught in school, it requires us to use our own initiative to go and not only learn about whatever our craft is, right? So in my case, not just learn about being an attorney, but now on top of that, I have to layer this entire racial curriculum onto my professional studies, right? Because I don't have access to it other places. So that took a lot of effort. It took a lot of work. It's a constant endeavor, right? Because racism is constantly transforming. It looks different in every era. It looked different in slavery and in Jim Crow, and it looks different every time. It looks different right now. It's changing right now. And so that requires a ton of exertion of our effort and our time. And then on top of that, the trauma that it might trigger, right? And so if this is valuable to you, if you want to transform your space, that's fantastic. You should pay for it. You pay for all the other things that are valuable to you. You should pay for it. It also sends a clear message that as a company or an organization or a municipality, you value this information, that this adds value to the company and you want to reward it accordingly. So you should do that.
Yes, and amen. Yes.
Quick
Ruth.
piggyback. So RaShaya, I know you're never going to get this finished. RaShaya, you talked about the curriculums in schools. So one of the things that I had to do was when I first started teaching 7th grade social studies, I flipped through the textbook, and the last president in that textbook was George Bush Jr. So we threw those textbooks out. When it comes to students using their voices, I've already heard of a few students who recognize the importance of hearing the stories that are often not told. We live in a very Eurocentric, specific type of schooling systems where the Greeks, the Romans, the Latins, or Latin, I'm sorry, is the center point of our curriculum. And normally you get a couple of pages of, Rosa Parks, she sat down, and then Martin Luther King came, but then he got shot, and then Malcolm X, I'm sorry, no one learns about Malcolm X in school. So the entire curriculum, and I'm speaking just to social studies because that's where my heart is. The entire social studies curriculum has to be changed, and it has to come from, or I won't say it has to, it needs to come from the voices of students, because they are the ones that are directly affected by the curriculums that they learn. It is expected that they know about the Greek and Roman empires, and yet there's absolutely nothing said about Mansa Musa. There's absolutely nothing said about the Black Panther Party. There's absolutely nothing said about Nat Turner. And it becomes the responsibility of the educators to figure out how to include this in their curriculum on top of all of the state mandated information. So my one ask, I would say, out of all of this is, if you have a child in school, or a school-age child, or if you are a student, to go out and demand that the curriculum changes, to go out and demand that there's more stories than just Plato and Aristotle and Archimedes. There's so much more in global history than just one continent. Africa gets a little bit, and when you're in like maybe 7th or 8th grade, but even then it's just like, okay, they were kings, slavery, Barack Obama. Like, that's what the curriculum looks like. So a change has to be had when it comes to the curriculum that children are learning, because I'm thankful that I went to an HBCU. So my African American studies class was so much more intense because it's an HBCU. I don't know, I can't speak on African American history classes at PWIs or private white institutions, but the things that I learned about, I would, to this day, have never had an opportunity to find out about had I not gone and attended a Black school with Black professors. And Black people become teachers. Look, we know that teaching is hard work. We all know it. On some level, every single person on this Zoom call is an educator, whether in the traditional standing in front of the classroom sense or simply imparting knowledge to others. We know that education is a difficult job, but children need to see and learn from quality Black educators, because you can be a Black person, and because all skin folk ain't kinfolk. So we know that. But if you have a passion for children, become a teacher. We are trying our hardest to put more equity, finances into the field of education, because finally, after COVID, everyone realizes how important a schoolhouse is. They realize it's not just the building that you send your kids to for 5 hours. I mean, you have parents out in Perrysburg when schools closed that were just like, wait, what are we supposed to do? Like, it affects everyone. But with TPS being, I want to say 49% African American, they need more quality Black educators standing in front of them. And this goes for the Black students and the white students, because white students and children of other ethnicities need to see Black men and women in positions of education, in positions of leadership, because for some of them, that may be the only time that they see it. And for you to be able to impart your knowledge as an educator, as a leader, leading this next generation, it is so imperative. These children are already coming out the gate ready to make changes. And all they need is someone to say, hey, all right, I can help you with this. I can help you with that. But if no one's there, it doesn't happen. And now they're leading themselves, and they don't always know the historical impact of what they're doing. And if someone can just be there to say, hey, I got you. Look out for this. Look out for that. Look out for them. Look out for her. It's imperative. Black educators, you are needed.
Yay. Now you're in my wheelhouse, because the research tells us that all students do better with quality Black teachers versus the opposite, and we see what's happening in the opposite. So in that vein, I'll give one shout out. I probably shouldn't do this, but the first Black teacher I had was Tracy Knighton, and I was in the 6th grade, and he was phenomenal in my life and gave me my first job, and he's still an administrator within TPS. And so every time I see him, I always have to give him a shout out. So we have 17 minutes, but there are 2 really good questions that have come up in the chat. One is on structural racism. I'll answer that. And then I want to end, because I think it circles back to what RaShaya mentioned, how to be free and advocate in the workplace. So this question is, what impact does structural racism have on mental health in Black communities? And are there local resources that are available in healing racial trauma?
Well, I'll jump in first. So we know, and I think it's been reiterated and shared through the conversation today, but when we're talking about education and our young people, representation matters. And we're socializing our children very young into a system that was not set up for them, right, to be successful. So as Ruth mentioned, if the content of the education does not include people that look like them, that represent their history or representation, that can say something to self-esteem, right? So people that contributed to society don't look like me. So how does that then set the tone for me to have expectations that I can contribute to society? And also, when you have schools that do not have Black teachers or Black administrators, and then you have people that may be working in the classroom that do not acknowledge the value and contributions of Black people across our history, we often find that they get in trouble more often. They have more instances of having diagnoses such as ADHD. We have students who are suspended, and so they lose a lot of classroom time as well. And we know that even state testing were not normed on minority children. So we've set up a system for achievement to be disproportionate. And then when you talk about then how that then affects the community, when you're talking about a system that's set up to teach our children from kindergarten all the way up, that they're not going to see themselves in the literature that they're reading. They're not going to see themselves in, or even be able to be taught by people that look like them, that they're being conditioned to what's going to happen next. And so what we find oftentimes is that, in that, we don't then often know how to expect something different. So our children they continue to go, they go from kindergarten to 1st grade on, and that becomes the normal, right? That we're not going to see someone that look like us. And when we're talking about the effects of that, it affects us in terms of our achievement gaps, which then affects that prison in the pipeline. It affects individuals in terms of, even when we talk about mental health, we often have situations where students are getting in trouble for things that we may be expecting them to not have a response. So I've seen situations where students get in trouble in school where a normal reaction, but because of what they look like, it's exacerbated, right? And so when we're talking about ways to heal, I think it's a multiple pronged approach. One, I think, goes to the system, right? So as Ruth mentioned, we have to have representation in the school. We also have to have representation in the content in the school, but also it also is important that we're providing that information even if it's not in the school. So being able to provide education to our students at home about their value, their worth, teaching them about their mental health and being mindful of that they matter, that their self-esteem is important, that they have a voice, and being able to create spaces for them to express that. So I think that's also another thing too. One of the things I struggle with, I don't with the young children, I will give you that. That's just not my area of expertise. But we're asking kids to sit down for 6 and 7 hours in a structured environment, and that's one particular way of learning. Does that not match what our kids need, right? And so when we're talking about how we can continue to broaden their opportunities and experience, we have to be able to also provide other spaces, because currently it's not widely provided in the school systems. So we have to also be making sure that they're getting that information somewhere, somehow, so that they know that they're valuable, that their life does matter, that it's not just about the structure of education at their school, but education as a whole, and that there's more information available to them that represents them. And as far as healing in the community, that I think is a bigger question. I think right now, because we're having more of these conversations, these things are developing. And so I think that you're going to start seeing places that are intentionally going to put things out there to address that. But I don't have one particular resource right now to say this is the place to go. But I think it does start in being able to acknowledge that the disparity exists, and what role we're taking to say, how am I validating this child's experience? Am I acknowledging, am I seeing them? Not just doing the children are to be seen and not heard. We need to start hearing them, because as you all said, they are going to be the ones that are going to help us out in this. And we have to start empowering them now. And in that helps them have a voice, see that well, not just what they say matter, but people that have come before them, that have looked like them, have said things too that have been important. And so that they're not having to create this path without any type of guidance, without any type of support. There is some there. There are people that look like them that are in the field, but they might just be far and wide. So it's going to be an evolving conversation.
Yes, thank you. Oh, go ahead, Quinlan, I'm sorry.
No, I'm just going to jump in because everything that Dr. Sullivan said is absolutely spot on. And, when I step into a classroom to teach youth, because I'm only a sexual health educator, so I only come in for a limited amount of time. But, with Ruth, it is important for them to see Black educators standing in front of them. But it's also, as we're teaching students, I think one big thing that has moved into the education space is being trauma informed when teaching. But I also, whenever I attend these trainings, I never hear anyone talk about racial trauma, and acknowledging that, being color conscious as well. I don't know how many times I've been in a classroom, right? And because of what I teach, I am more hypersensitive to, that sexual trauma may have occurred, so I'm more hypersensitive to being aware of how my students are feeling and feeling the room. But I don't know how many times where I can have a student, while I'm, just talking about basic anatomy, stand up and pace in the back of my room, and it be a student of color, and that teacher immediately want to remove them from the space instead of letting them just sit or exit the room or something, right? Instead of recognizing that maybe that student just isn't dealing with this subject, or, and I feel like the first response is always to punish instead of to talk to that student or give them the space and the grace to express how they're feeling, right? And I think that is something that we need to instill. And, teachers are already doing a lot of things, and I understand that, but that's something that we need to normalize, is telling our Black children that these things are okay, right? Even though you are experiencing trauma throughout your life and all of these experiences, and it is okay to be angry, it is okay to be confused. I think a lot of times we tell our Black kids, right, I don't know how many times we tell our Black kids, just, swallow it kind of thing. And it's we need to normalize that that you are suffering under a system of oppression. You are experiencing racism throughout your life. And it is okay to have feelings around that and to be upset and to be angry. But we also need to, instill that in our educators and in our systems. And we need to, the fact that there are more cops in schools than counselors speaks to how much that we value our children's mental health overall. But I think when we're talking about, these different forms of teaching and being trauma informed and all these things, I like what RaShaya said too, being color conscious as well. You need to bring all of these things through a racial lens as well. And because our schools are where we see the prison to pipeline start. And if we're not acknowledging that our students are literally surviving racism by merely existing and giving them the space to process that, then we really can't help them move forward in their own mental health journeys.
Thank you.
I think what she said is so important for two reasons. One, I think one of the things that we've all said that is really going to be important, especially for organizations moving forward, is that diversity is not the same as anti-racism, right? So your organization can be fantastic at diversity and diversifying your staff and diversifying your clientele and maybe even diversifying the literature and campaigns you have and all that jazz. That does not mean that you have an anti-racist space. So one of the things I'm hoping grows out of this movement here locally is that our local organizations, our local government centers anti-racism, right? Because that forces you to ask a lot of the questions that are going to lead to some of the answers and the solutions that we're proposing and that you're looking for. If you have to run your programming, if you have to run your office policies, if you have to run whatever through the lens of, is this anti-racist? And what does that look like? What do I expect that to mean for this program or for this policy, right? I think that's going to be so important because we've conflated racial justice with diversity, anti-racism, and we feel like if we have a diversity policy, then we've solved all these problems, and we haven't, and that's why we're still having to have this dialogue. So I'm really hoping that organizations start to craft anti-racist policies at the center of their organization, and that becomes a culture, and we start normalizing that, and that shifts how we think about racism and what our job and what our role is in making sure that we effectuate equality. So that's the first thing I was going to say. And the second thing I was going to say is that all of these systems are related. It's also important for us to think about them that way. Our policing system, our education system, these things are not mutually exclusive. Our impulse to always employ punitive measures informs both our education system and our police department. It's why we're having this knee-jerk reaction. Ruth is waving her hands at what I'm saying, so it's going well, guys. That's why we always have this knee-jerk reaction when we talk about defunding, right? When we talk about maybe we should scale back the police's budget a little bit and reinvest that money in some education and some community programs, everyone freaks out about safety because all we understand is punitiveness leads to safety, even though the literature and the data is inconsistent with that. It says no, the opposite is true, right? Read the Kerner Commission, it's all in there, I promise. Right? And so this idea that punitive carceral responses are the only solution informs both our police department, and it's why we put police in schools instead of putting counselors on the police department, right? And so it's really important that we start to shift our thinking about these things if we're going to make substantive changes. And I'm done.
This OMG was...
Wait. Sorry. Okay. Yeah. I just want to throw one thing in.
Go ahead.
Okay. So my one thing. So RaShaya is talking about how all of these things are interconnected. And so one of the things that I'm really interested in doing is forming a committee of people who can use their gifts and talents to tackle some of the inequalities that we have structurally in Toledo specifically. So I just want to throw it out there really quickly. When we talk about everything being interconnected, that includes education, libraries, community health, food deserts, housing, prison reform, workforce development. That includes our physically and developmentally disabled community. That includes people who suffer from substance abuse or addiction, and then also small businesses. All of those things come together. But when you look at it from a global perspective, you may only think of white supremacy as police violence. But white supremacy runs through everything that I just named. And so that's why this forum is so important, because even in us talking and having this conversation, we were talking about emotional healing, but the emotional healing has to take place across the board. Structurally, the foundation has to crumble in order for us to rebuild it, because like RaShaya, I believe, said, it's baked into the foundation. White supremacy is baked in. And when you look at how white supremacy manifests itself in all of these different areas, you have to destroy it in order to rebuild it. So it's really important that anyone who's a part of this virtual town hall to figure out a way that you can help in one of those areas. And it doesn't have to be through me. Just reach out and voice your concerns. And that's how you start the conversation. If you see something wrong, if you see something, make sure you are using your privilege as a voter, as someone who puts these people in these positions, make sure you're talking to the people who are directly related to making those changes. We had, there was this potential of of all of the political change agents having a march where they wanted to march in solidarity. And I was completely against it because I don't need politicians to march. I don't need politicians to put on their kente cloths and take a knee. I don't need politicians to do all of this performative politics. I need you to do your job. I think RaShaya made a post about this. I need you as a lawmaker to change the laws, to whip the votes, to get these structural changes started so that we can continue to move forward in a world that is not based on white supremacy. It's time to change it up, to shake it up. So that's what I got for that.
Yes, and amen. And so I am going to wrap this up in 2 minutes. You guys are awesome. So for those of you watching, we appreciate you joining in with us today. And I'm going to give you some awesome tidbits. Please, if you want to reach our women on the panel, Google them. They have Facebook, Instagram, Dr. Latasha Sullivan, Ruth Leonard, Quinlan Tyler, RaShaya Ghee. Look them up. They are approachable and they are experts in their craft. Please take note of this. Color conscious is what we need, not race neutrality. Empower young people. When you're empowering young people, give them a reason and give them some oomph because we need young people. Do allies. Do something with what you learn. Learn it, take it back home. We need you to do that. Everyone, vet your politicians. As RaShaya said, there is one that is not living up to what he said, Gary Johnson. Vet your politicians, vet your allies, vet your educators, vet everyone that has some voice in this interconnected system that we've all been talking about. And last but not least, I want to say that this is the beginning of a movement that is in a new era. We've talked about what happened in civil rights. This is something new, and we're slowly seeing things dismantle. So please hone in on your gifts. Do as RaShaya and all of the women on the panel said, be free to be your authentic self and use your voice to what matters. I am Dr. P. I love y'all double time, and we are signing out. Peace.